Hey, today we are going to have our video on add and subtract decimals. Make sure you write that down as your heading. Our learning target is students can solve real-world problems by adding or subtracting decimals. So in this video I'm going to go over the basics of how you add and subtract decimals. If you need to pause, go ahead. Otherwise, I will be moving on to the first example. Okay, in example 1, we're going to be talking about adding decimals. So in A, so make sure you write down your piece of paper example 1, adding decimals, and then you write down example A, write down the problem, and then all the work I'm going to show. When you are going to add decimals, the key when you add decimals is to line up the decimal points. So I'm going to make that little note right there. Line up decimal points. Okay? The reason you want to do that, just like adding whole numbers, subtracting whole numbers, you really need place values to be stacked on top of each other. That's the important thing, and the decimal point helps you make sure that occurs. So I'm going to do 12 and 34 hundredths plus 9 and 84 hundredths. So I have my place values stacked on top of each other. I have my tenths, my ones, okay, and then remember this is the tenths place and this is the hundredths place. Okay, and those have to be stacked. Now I can add down. I have 4 hundredths and 4 hundredths. That means I have 8 hundredths. I have 3 tenths plus 8 tenths, which means I have 11 tenths. Okay, so I'm going to put one of those, carry the other one. My decimal point moves straight down. That's important about lining them up. 1 plus 2 plus 9 is 12, so I'm going to put the 2, carry the 1, and I end up with 22 and 18 hundredths. Okay, make sure you always circle or box in your answer, and that's how you do that. Okay, if you need to pause, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next example. Okay, still example 1, adding decimals. I'm going to do letter B. So, line up my place values. 27 and 8 tenths plus 16 and 45 hundredths. Use your decimal point to help you line them up. The 4s and the tenths, the 5s here. Now that gives me a blank above the 5. Remember, after a decimal point, you can annex, it's called annexing zeros as placeholders. So I can put a 0 there. Now, I have a number in each thing, they all line up. 0 plus 5 is 5, 4 plus 8 is 12. Again, I put the 2, carry the 1. Make sure my decimal point moves straight down. 1 plus 7 plus 6 is 14. Put the 4, carry the 1. 1 plus 2 plus 1 is 4. And I end up with 44 and 25 hundredths. Okay, again, if you need to pause, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to my next example. Okay, now in example 2, subtracting decimals, we're going to move on to A. So we're going to do the same thing. You want to make sure you line up your decimal points. And the important thing about lining up those decimal points is that you want to make sure that your place values are all lined up. So I'm going to do 15 and 5 hundredths minus 11 and 53 hundredths. Okay, again, I have my tenths lined up, my ones, my decimal points are lined up, my tenths and my hundredths are lined up. Now I can subtract. 5 minus 3 is 2. 0 minus 5, I cannot do that, so I have to borrow. So that becomes a 10. I'm going to regroup. That becomes 10. I have to borrow from the 5, though from the left. I have to borrow one set from that. So I take away a set from that, and I add that set, that 10, to the tenths place there. Okay? I can borrow over the decimal point. That does not affect that. 10 minus 5 is 5. My decimal point moves down. 4 minus 1 is 3. 1 minus 1 is 1. So my final, or 0, excuse me. So my final answer is 3 and 52 hundredths. Okay, make sure you subtract on these. You got to pay attention to that. You don't want to make that mistake of accidentally adding. So it's important to pay attention to those. Okay, if you need to pause, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to my next example. Okay, in my final example here, we're still subtracting. I have a whole number minus a decimal. So I'm going to line up my place values. My decimal point is after the 18. And then I'm going to do 7 and 23 hundredths. I have to annex a couple zeros here to use as placeholders. Now I'm going to subtract. Again, that I cannot do, so that becomes 10. I have to borrow from one to the left. Since that's a 0, that becomes a 9, and I have to borrow one from the left, and that becomes a 7. Now I can subtract. 10 minus 3 is 7. 9 minus 2 is 7. Decimal point moves down. 7 minus 7 is 0. 1 minus 0 is 1. So you get 10 and 77 hundredths as your final answer. Okay, that's it. If you need to watch anything again, go ahead and go back. Otherwise, have a great night.